The moment a security guard placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, just as my grandson reached for his birthday candles, I knew someone in that room was about to regret a terrible mistake. My name is Margaret Bennett. I am 73 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed family meant something. The birthday party was being held at a beautiful event venue outside Dallas. Colorful balloons floated above neatly decorated tables. Children laughed as they ran across the room. Parents gathered near the dessert station. A giant cake covered in blue frosting sat in the center of everything, waiting for my grandson Ethan to make his wish. I had driven nearly 60 miles from my ranch that morning to be there. In my hands was a carefully wrapped gift I had spent months preparing. It was not expensive. It was not flashy, but it was meaningful. Ethan had been talking about it for nearly a year. I arrived 20 minutes before the candle ceremony and immediately noticed the way my daughter-in-law Lauren looked at me. Her smile appeared for only a second before disappearing. I should have recognized the warning. For months, Lauren had made it clear that she considered me an embarrassment. She disliked my simple clothes. She disliked my ranch. She disliked the fact that I preferred practical boots over designer shoes. Most of all, she disliked that I never pretended to be someone I was not. Still, I came for Ethan. I always came for Ethan. He was standing near the cake when he spotted me. His face lit up instantly. "Grandma!" he shouted before running across the room. He threw his arms around me and nearly knocked the gift from my hands. I laughed and hugged him tightly. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. Then Lauren appeared. Her expression hardened the moment she saw Ethan standing beside me. "The candles are ready," she announced. Guests gathered around the table. Phones appeared to capture photographs. Ethan stood proudly behind the cake while everyone sang. I moved quietly toward the back of the crowd, happy just to watch him enjoy his day. Then it happened. A security guard approached me. At first I assumed there had been some misunderstanding. The young man looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I need to speak with you." Before I could answer, Lauren stepped forward. Her voice carried across the room. "Get this tacky old woman out of here." The words landed harder than I expected. Conversation stopped instantly. The singing ended. Several guests looked down at the floor. Others stared at Lauren in disbelief. Ethan's smile vanished. "Mom," he said quietly. Lauren ignored him. "She is ruining the atmosphere," she continued. "Please escort her out." The security guard looked embarrassed. I could tell he wished he were anywhere else. Across the room, my son Michael stood frozen. He looked at Lauren. Then he looked at me. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than her words. I glanced at Ethan. The poor boy looked confused and frightened. His birthday candles still burned on top of the cake. I took a slow breath and handed him the gift. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said. My voice remained calm. My hands remained steady. Ethan clutched the package against his chest. Tears filled his eyes. I turned toward the exit. No arguments. No scene. No pleading. Just dignity. As I reached the doorway, I paused and looked back one final time. Lauren stood there believing she had won. Michael stood beside her saying nothing. The guests remained silent. Ethan watched me leave. Then I smiled gently and said the only thing that came to mind. "Tomorrow, someone in this family is going to wish they had treated me differently." The drive back to my ranch felt longer than 60 miles that afternoon. The Texas highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, while Ethan's face remained fixed in my mind. Out of everything that happened at the party, that was the image I could not forget. Not Lauren's words. Not the guests staring at me. Not even Michael's silence. It was Ethan standing beside his birthday cake holding the gift I had brought him, trying to understand why his grandmother was being treated like a stranger. By the time I reached my property, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. The familiar sight of rolling pasture and weathered fences usually brought me peace. That evening it only reminded me how different my life had become from the one my son now lived. I parked beside the farmhouse and carried my purse inside. The house was quiet. It had been quiet ever since my husband, Robert Bennett, passed away 6 years earlier. He loved this ranch. He used to joke that he trusted cattle more than people because cattle never pretended to be something they were not. At the time I laughed. Lately I found myself understanding exactly what he meant. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and poured a glass of iced tea. Before I could take a sip, my phone buzzed. For a moment I hoped it might be Ethan. Instead, it was a text from Michael. I opened it immediately. The message was short. "Mom, Lauren was upset. You should have just left quietly." I stared at the screen. Then I read it again. Not one word asking whether I was all right. Not one word acknowledging what had happened. Just an explanation for Lauren's behavior. Slowly, I set the phone down. That was when I finally understood something I had been refusing to admit for months. The problem was not one afternoon. The problem had been growing for a long time. For months earlier, Ethan had invited me to one of his baseball games. I arrived carrying orange slices and homemade cookies. Lauren barely looked at me when I sat down. After the game, Ethan asked if I wanted to join them for dinner. Before I could answer, Lauren explained they already had reservations and could not add another person. 2 months later, I was left off the guest list for a family barbecue. Lauren claimed it had been an oversight. Then there was Mother's Day. Michael called to apologize because they were too busy to visit. Later that evening, I saw photographs online showing the entire family having dinner at an expensive restaurant. Each event by itself seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern. I carried my tea onto the porch and sat in the rocking chair Robert built years ago. The air smelled of fresh grass and distant rain. As darkness settled over the ranch, my phone rang again. This time I recognized the name immediately. Thomas Reed, my late husband's attorney. We had not spoken in several weeks. "Margaret," he said after I answered, "I was hoping to reach you tonight." There was something unusual in his voice. Something serious. "Is everything all right?" I asked. He paused briefly. "That depends on how you define all right." I sat up straighter. "What happened?" Another pause followed. "I received some information today about the birthday party." I looked out across the darkening pasture. "News travels quickly." "Sometimes it does," Thomas replied. Then his voice lowered slightly. "Margaret, there is a reason I am calling. There is something your husband instructed me to do if certain circumstances ever arose." My grip tightened around the phone. Robert had always planned carefully, sometimes years ahead. "What circumstances?" I asked quietly. Thomas took a slow breath. "The kind that reveal who people truly are." Suddenly, the evening felt very different. And for the first time since leaving the party, I began to suspect that Lauren's victory might not last very long. That night, I slept very little. Thomas's words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. The kind that reveal who people truly are. Robert had always believed that character mattered more than success, more than money, more than appearances. He used to say that anyone could look respectable when life was easy. The real test came when people thought nobody was watching. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had for decades. The ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle moving across the pasture. I carried a cup of coffee onto the porch and watched the first lights spread across the fields. The land looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same fences, the same oak trees, the same dirt road winding toward the highway. Yet something felt different. For the first time in months, I no longer felt confused. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Around 9 o'clock, Thomas arrived at the ranch. His silver sedan rolled slowly up the driveway and stopped beside the house. He stepped out carrying a leather briefcase that I recognized immediately. I had seen that briefcase many times over the years during meetings with Robert. Whenever it appeared, important matters usually followed. We sat together at the kitchen table. Thomas placed the briefcase beside him but did not open it right away. Instead, he looked around the room. Photographs of family vacations lined the walls. Ethan's school portraits sat beside older pictures of Michael as a child. Memories filled every corner of the house. "Robert loved this place," Thomas said quietly. "He did," I replied. "Sometimes I think he loved this ranch more than the city." Thomas smiled. "You are probably right." Then his expression grew serious. "Margaret, there are some things you need to know." He opened the briefcase and removed several folders. Most carried dates from years earlier. Robert's signature appeared across many of the pages. Seeing his handwriting again brought an unexpected ache to my chest. Thomas carefully organized the documents before speaking. "Your husband made several decisions before he passed away. Decisions designed to protect the family." I frowned slightly. "Protect us from what?" Thomas hesitated. "From ourselves." The answer surprised me. He slid one folder across the table. I looked at the cover but did not open it. "Robert became concerned during his final years," Thomas continued. "Not because of finances. The company was strong. The investments were secure. He was concerned about entitlement." The word immediately made me think of Lauren. But Thomas was not finished. He worried that future generations might start valuing appearances more than character. I looked down at the folder. Suddenly, several conversations from years ago came rushing back. Robert asking unusual questions during family dinners. Robert observing people more than speaking. Robert quietly taking notes after gatherings. At the time, I thought he was simply becoming reflective as he grew older. Now I wondered if he had been paying attention to warning signs that I ignored. My phone buzzed on the table. A text message appeared from Ethan. My heart softened instantly. "Grandma, I miss you. Thank you for my gift. It is the best birthday present I ever got." I smiled despite everything. Ethan was still Ethan. Honest. Kind. Uncomplicated. Thomas noticed my expression. "That boy reminds me of Robert." I nodded. "More every year." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Good. Because the next few days may reveal a great deal about the rest of the family." I looked out the kitchen window toward the open pasture. Somewhere beyond those fields, Lauren was probably convinced she had removed an obstacle from her life. Michael was likely standing beside her, just as he always did. Neither of them knew what Robert had set into motion years earlier. Neither of them understood that some decisions do not begin when documents are opened. Some decisions begin the moment people show you exactly who they are. After Thomas left that afternoon, I finally opened the folder Robert had prepared years earlier. I expected legal language. I expected financial documents. Instead, the first thing I found was a handwritten letter addressed to me. Seeing Robert's familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. I sat alone at the kitchen table and carefully unfolded the pages. The letter began simply, "If you are reading this, then certain things have happened exactly as I feared they might." I continued reading slowly. Robert wrote about family, about responsibility, about the difference between inheritance and entitlement. He explained that wealth was never meant to reward the loudest voice in the room. It was meant to support people who understood gratitude, humility, and stewardship. Halfway through the letter, I stopped and stared out the window. Robert had written those words nearly 6 years earlier, yet they described the present with unsettling accuracy. The next section of the letter focused on Ethan. My grandson's name appeared repeatedly throughout the pages. Robert loved all of his family, but Ethan had always held a special place in his heart. Even as a small child, Ethan possessed a kindness that could not be taught. He thanked people without being reminded. He shared without being asked. He listened when others spoke. Robert noticed those qualities long before anyone else did. As I continued reading, I discovered something even more surprising. Several years before his death, Robert had established a private educational trust intended specifically for Ethan's future. It was not designed to make him wealthy. It was designed to give him opportunities. College, professional training, business development, whatever path Ethan chose in life. The trust would remain protected until he reached adulthood. But there was one unusual condition. The trust would only remain active if the family leadership committee determined that Ethan maintained regular contact with designated family mentors. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. One of those designated mentors was me. Suddenly everything made sense. Robert had understood something important. Success required more than money. It required guidance, values, relationships. The trust was never just about Ethan's future. It was about protecting the influence of the people who genuinely cared about him. Later that evening, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Grandma," he said. His voice sounded hesitant. "Did I do something wrong?" My heart nearly broke. "Of course not, sweetheart." "Then why did Mom want you to leave?" The question hung between us. I chose my words carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, Ethan." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted you there." I closed my eyes. I wanted to be there too. Another silence followed. Then Ethan said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "Grandpa always said you were the strongest person in the family." I smiled softly. Robert used to tell him that when he was younger. "Your grandfather gave me too much credit." "No," Ethan replied. "I think he was right." After we ended the call, I sat alone on the porch watching darkness settle across the ranch. Somewhere in the city, Lauren probably believed the birthday party had accomplished exactly what she wanted. She believed she had pushed me farther away from the family. What she did not know was that Robert had spent years preparing for situations exactly like this. He understood that people reveal themselves eventually, not during celebrations, not when everything is easy. They reveal themselves when they think they have finally gained control. And with every hour that passed, I became more certain that Lauren had no idea what was waiting just ahead. 2 days after Thomas visited the ranch, another call arrived. This time it came shortly after breakfast while I was repairing a fence near the eastern pasture. The number belonged to Thomas again, and the moment I answered, I could hear a different tone in his voice. The waiting was over. "Margaret," he said, "the committee meeting has been scheduled." I leaned against the fence post and listened carefully. "When?" I asked. "Friday afternoon. Everyone has been notified." For several seconds I said nothing. Robert's plans were finally moving forward. "Has Michael been informed?" I asked. "Yes." Thomas paused, and based on his reaction, I suspect he believes the meeting is simply a formality. That did not surprise me. For years, Michael had assumed certain things would eventually belong to him. Not because he was a bad man, because he stopped questioning the assumptions that surrounded him. Lauren encouraged those assumptions every chance she got. She talked about the future as though it had already been delivered. She spoke about responsibility without first earning it. Most importantly, she treated people differently depending on what she believed they could offer her. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the morning thinking about Robert. He always said that patience reveals more than pressure. If you give people enough time, they eventually tell you exactly who they are. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up supplies. While loading feed into my truck, I noticed a familiar voice behind me. "Mrs. Bennett." I turned and found one of the guests from Ethan's birthday party standing nearby. Her name was Carol Simmons. She had known our family for years. Her expression looked uncomfortable. "I have been meaning to call you," she said. I smiled politely. "You found me instead." Carol nodded. "I wanted to tell you something." We stepped aside near the parking lot. Carol lowered her voice. "A lot of people were shocked by what happened at the party." I said nothing. She continued. "Lauren spent weeks planning that event. She was obsessed with appearances. Everything had to look perfect. The statement did not surprise me." "There is more," Carol said. Several guests overheard her saying she wanted certain people kept away from the photographs. I already knew where the conversation was going. Carol looked genuinely embarrassed. "She mentioned you specifically." For a moment, I stared across the parking lot at the passing traffic. The strange thing was that her words no longer hurt. They simply confirmed what I already understood. Lauren had not acted impulsively. She had planned it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Carol sighed with relief. "I just thought you deserved to know." That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the ranch, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Michael. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, I wanted to let you know we have a family meeting on Friday." I almost smiled. "So I have heard." "Good," he replied. "I think there will be some exciting announcements." Exciting announcements. The phrase told me everything. He still believed the future was unfolding exactly as he expected. "Perhaps," I said calmly. "You should come." "I plan to." A brief silence followed. Then he added, "Lauren is already making plans for after the meeting." I looked out across the dark pasture. Somewhere in the distance, a windmill turned slowly beneath the evening sky. "That seems a little early," I replied. Michael laughed softly. "Trust me, everything is going to work out." After we ended the call, I sat quietly on the porch. The stars gradually appeared overhead. Robert's letter rested on the table beside me. The committee meeting was now less than 48 hours away. Lauren believed she was approaching a victory. Michael believed he was approaching a promotion. Neither of them realized that the meeting was not designed to reward expectations. It was designed to measure character. And character has a way of revealing itself at exactly the right moment. Friday arrived bright and clear. I left the ranch shortly after sunrise and began the drive into Dallas. The highway was busy with morning traffic, but my thoughts remained elsewhere. Robert's letter sat inside my purse. I had read it several times during the week. Each time, I noticed something new. Not because the words changed, but because events kept proving how carefully he had understood people. By the time I reached the city, the meeting was only an hour away. It was being held inside the headquarters of Bennett Holdings, the company Robert had spent nearly 40 years building. The glass tower stood above downtown like a monument to hard work and patience. Thousands of employees had built careers there. Families had bought homes because of opportunities created within those walls. Yet lately, some people seemed to think the company existed only as a prize waiting to be claimed. When I entered the lobby, several longtime employees greeted me warmly. Their kindness reminded me that not everyone had forgotten where the company came from. One woman who had worked with Robert for over 20 years hugged me and whispered, "He would be proud of you." I thanked her and continued toward the elevators. The meeting was scheduled in the executive conference room on the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire city. A long polished table occupied the center of the room. As people arrived, conversations filled the space. Board members, senior executives, family representatives. Everyone seemed curious about what would happen. Then Lauren entered. She looked exactly as I expected. Confident, perfectly dressed, completely certain of herself. Michael walked beside her carrying the same quiet optimism he had displayed during our phone call. Lauren greeted several people and spoke as though she already belonged in a leadership position. More than once, I noticed her gesturing toward the head chair at the table. The chair Robert used to occupy. The chair she clearly imagined becoming part of her future. Neither of them paid much attention to me when they arrived. That was fine. They had spent years underestimating me. One more hour would not make a difference. Thomas entered shortly before 2 o'clock, carrying the same leather briefcase I had seen at the ranch. The room gradually settled into silence. Chairs moved. Papers were arranged. Conversations faded. Thomas stood at the front of the room and looked around carefully before speaking. "Thank you all for attending," he began. "Today we are reviewing final directives established by Robert Bennett regarding succession planning, governance authority, and future family leadership responsibilities." Lauren sat up straighter. Michael folded his hands on the table. Their anticipation was impossible to miss. Thomas opened the briefcase and removed several folders. The first documents covered routine business matters, financial reports, organizational procedures, committee recommendations. Nothing unexpected. Lauren occasionally exchanged confident glances with Michael. She appeared eager for the formalities to end. Finally, Thomas reached a different folder. The room became noticeably quieter. Several years before his passing, Thomas said, Robert Bennett established a succession framework designed to protect both the company and the family. I focused on him. Under this framework, leadership authority would not transfer automatically based solely on family relationship. Lauren's smile faded slightly. Thomas continued reading. All candidates would be evaluated according to standards defined personally by Robert Bennett. These standards include stewardship, integrity, treatment of family members, and demonstrated character. Across the table, several board members lowered their eyes toward the documents in front of them. Michael frowned for the first time. Lauren shifted slightly in her chair. The confidence that had followed them into the room suddenly seemed less secure. And as Thomas turned the next page, I realized the moment Robert had prepared for years earlier was finally beginning. The room remained silent as Thomas turned another page. The atmosphere had changed completely. Only a few minutes earlier, Lauren and Michael had looked relaxed. Now both appeared uncertain. Thomas adjusted his glasses and continued reading from Robert's instructions. The succession committee completed its review under the standards established by Robert Bennett. Several board members exchanged brief glances. They already knew what was coming. Lauren clearly did not. Michael sat forward in his chair. "What review?" he asked. Thomas looked up calmly. "A review of leadership suitability." Michael frowned. Nobody mentioned that. "The process was outlined in documents signed several years ago," Thomas replied. Then he continued reading. "The committee examined business conduct, treatment of family members, community involvement, personal integrity, and stewardship responsibilities." Every word seemed to make Lauren more uncomfortable. She folded her arms and stared at the papers in front of her. Thomas reached the next section. The committee determined that several candidates failed to satisfy the standards required for succession consideration. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Michael's face tightened. Lauren immediately spoke. "Which candidates?" Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened another document and placed it on the table. "The findings are detailed in the report available to all committee members." Lauren's confidence finally cracked. I asked a simple question. Thomas remained calm. "The report identifies both Michael Bennett and Lauren Bennett as failing to meet the standards established by Robert Bennett." Complete silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Michael looked genuinely stunned. Lauren stared at Thomas as though she had misheard him. "That is impossible," she said. "There has to be a mistake." Thomas slid a copy of the report toward her. "There is no mistake." Lauren began reading. Her expression changed line by line. Shock replaced certainty. Michael looked at the board members surrounding the table. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked disappointed rather than surprised. The review had not happened overnight. People had been paying attention for years. Thomas continued. The committee found evidence of repeated behavior inconsistent with the values identified by Robert Bennett. He paused briefly before reading further. These findings include exclusionary treatment of family members, prioritization of status over stewardship, misuse of influence within family relationships, and conduct demonstrating insufficient respect toward designated family mentors. I noticed Lauren's hand stop moving across the page. She knew exactly what those words referred to. The birthday party, the years before it, the pattern of behavior she believed nobody noticed. Across the room, Michael lowered his head. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked less confused and more reflective. Thomas closed one folder and opened another. As a result of these findings, leadership authority will not transfer to either candidate at this time. Lauren looked up immediately. Then who receives authority? Thomas glanced toward me. Every head in the room followed his gaze. The answer arrived before he even spoke. Under the succession structure established by Robert Bennett, primary oversight remains with Margaret Bennett as trustee and governing authority until a qualified successor is approved. The room became completely still. Lauren stared at me. Michael stared at me. For years they had viewed me as a retired widow living quietly on a ranch. Now they were discovering how little they actually understood. Thomas continued. Additionally, all educational and developmental trusts connected to future family leadership remain under trustee supervision. My thoughts immediately went to Ethan. Robert had protected him, not with money alone, with values, with guidance, with time. Michael finally spoke. His voice sounded quieter than before. Mom, you knew about this? I met his eyes. Your father discussed many things with me. Lauren looked down at the report once more. There was no anger in her expression now, only disbelief. The future she had imagined was disappearing with every page. Thomas lifted the final document. There is one additional statement from Robert Bennett. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Thomas began reading aloud. If those seeking leadership first seek recognition, they are not ready. If those seeking authority fail to honor the people who helped build the foundation beneath them, they are certainly not ready. The words settled heavily across the room. Robert was gone, yet somehow he was still speaking directly to every person present. And for the first time since the meeting began, I realized this was not simply about inheritance. It was about consequences, the kind that arrive quietly after years of choices. For several moments after Thomas finished reading, nobody spoke. The city skyline stretched beyond the conference room windows, but inside the room it felt as though time had stopped. Lauren remained motionless, staring at the documents in front of her. Michael sat quietly beside her, his eyes fixed on the table. The confidence they had carried into the meeting was gone. In its place stood something far more difficult. Reflection. Thomas carefully organized the papers and closed the folder. His responsibility was complete. Robert's wishes had been delivered exactly as intended. One of the senior board members cleared his throat and looked toward me. Mrs. Bennett, he said respectfully, what would you like to do moving forward? It was a simple question, yet every person in the room seemed to lean toward the answer. I folded my hands and took a slow breath. We continue exactly as Robert planned, I replied. Several executives nodded immediately. Relief appeared on more than one face. Stability mattered. Employees depended on it. Families depended on it. The company was never supposed to become a trophy. It was supposed to remain a responsibility. Michael finally looked up. Mom, he said quietly, I think I have misunderstood a lot of things. The honesty in his voice surprised me. Not because he admitted a mistake, but because it was the first genuine thing he had said all afternoon. I met his eyes. Understanding usually begins after assumptions end. He lowered his head slightly. Across the table, Lauren remained silent. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed more interested in listening than speaking. Thomas opened one final document. There is another matter concerning Ethan's future, he said. Immediately, every person in the room paid attention. Ethan's name carried weight. He was the next generation. Robert knew that. Thomas continued. The educational trust remains fully active. However, Robert included a personal statement regarding Ethan's development. He unfolded a page and began reading. Character is not inherited. It is learned. Therefore, Ethan shall continue receiving guidance from those who demonstrate integrity. humility, and commitment to family. My heart tightened slightly as Robert's words filled the room. Then Thomas added something nobody expected. Robert specifically identified Margaret Bennett as Ethan's primary family mentor. A quiet silence followed. Several board members smiled. One even nodded in approval. Across the room, Michael looked genuinely emotional. Lauren slowly turned toward me. Her expression was different now. Not defensive, not arrogant, simply thoughtful. The realization seemed to settle over her all at once. Everything Robert built had never been centered on money. It had been centered on values. Money simply followed those values. After the meeting ended, people gradually began leaving the conference room. Executives gathered documents. Board members exchanged handshakes. Conversations returned, but they sounded different than before. Nobody discussed titles. Nobody discussed promotions. They discussed trust. They discussed responsibility. As I prepared to leave, Michael approached me. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. Ethan asks about you almost every day. I smiled softly. I ask about him too. Michael nodded. I think there are things we need to fix. The statement was simple, but it carried more weight than a dozen apologies. Real change begins with recognition. Nearby, Lauren remained standing beside the conference table. She appeared lost in thought. She did not approach me. She did not defend herself. She simply watched as people left the room. And for the first time since the birthday party, I sensed that she was finally beginning to understand something Robert had known for years. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be staged for photographs. It cannot be purchased through status. It is earned slowly through choices, through consistency, through the way people treat others when there is nothing to gain. As I stepped toward the elevator, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan appeared on the screen. Only 6 words. Grandma, when are you coming over? I smiled. In that moment, every complicated document, every meeting, and every painful conversation seemed far less important than the simple truth contained in those 6 words. 3 weeks later, Ethan spent his first weekend at the ranch since the birthday party. The moment his parents' car disappeared down the gravel road, he jumped out of the passenger seat and ran toward the porch with the same energy he had when he was 6 years old. Some things had not changed, and I was grateful for that. The afternoon passed quietly. We walked through the pasture together, fed the horses, and sat beside the pond where Robert used to spend hours talking about life. Ethan carried the fishing pole his grandfather had given him years earlier. Every so often he would ask a question about Robert, and I would tell another story. By sunset, we were sitting on the old wooden bench overlooking the water. The sky glowed orange and gold across the Texas horizon. Ethan was unusually quiet. Finally, he looked up at me. Grandma, can I ask you something? I smiled. You can ask me anything. He hesitated before speaking. Why were people acting so strange at my birthday? Children often see more than adults realize. I took a slow breath. Because sometimes people become distracted by things that are not important. Ethan thought about that for a moment. Like money. The question surprised me. Why do you ask? He looked out across the pond. Because Grandpa always said money was a tool. He said people who treated it like a trophy usually ended up unhappy. I laughed softly. That sounds exactly like your grandfather. Ethan smiled. Then his expression became serious again. Mom and Dad have been different lately. I listened carefully. Different how? They argue less. Dad talks more. Mom spends more time with me. He shrugged. It feels different. I nodded slowly. Real lessons rarely arrive through speeches. Most arrive through consequences. During the following weeks, small changes continued. Michael called regularly. Not because he needed something. Simply because he wanted to talk. The conversations felt awkward at first, but they gradually became easier. One evening he admitted something I never expected to hear. I spent years letting other people make decisions for me, he said. I thought keeping the peace was the same as doing the right thing. I understood exactly what he meant. Lauren changed too, although more slowly. Trust is difficult to rebuild once it has been broken. Still, I noticed the effort. She called one afternoon and apologized without excuses. No explanations. No justifications. Just an apology. I appreciated that. Whether relationships heal completely depends on time, not words. Autumn eventually arrived. The company remained strong. The board remained stable. Employees continued building the future Robert envisioned. Most importantly, Ethan continued growing into the young man his grandfather hoped he would become. One evening, several months later, the entire family gathered at the ranch for dinner. Not at a country club, not at an expensive venue, just family sitting together beneath the wide Texas sky. As I watched Ethan laugh with his parents, I thought back to the moment a security guard approached me at his birthday party. At the time, it felt like the worst day I had experienced in years. Looking back, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a moment of truth. Truth does not always arrive comfortably. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in disappointment. Sometimes it arrives through betrayal. But when it finally appears, it reveals everything that matters. Before everyone left that evening, Ethan handed me a folded piece of paper. "I made something for you," he said. Inside was a simple drawing of our family standing together in front of the ranch. Above it, he had written a sentence in large letters. "Grandpa said family means showing up." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Robert spent his life trying to teach that lesson. In the end, it was not the company, the trust, or the inheritance that preserved his legacy. It was a little boy who listened. And as I watched the sun disappear beyond the pasture, I realized I had never wanted victory. What I wanted was exactly what sat before me. A family finally learning the difference between status and character.